Hello, everybody. You may be here today working for a large organization or indeed an SME. And if you're working for a large organization, your focus right now and the reason why you're here to listen to a conversation on this topic could be to do with the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. If you're working for an SME, you could be here because you're trying to build a foundational strategy and just want to gain an insight into a word that seems to be thrown around just as much as sustainability has been as a buzzword over the last few years in recent times. While the different types of people in the room today may be different, there's one thing that unites everybody, and that can be found in a simple statistic. So in Europe alone, 75% of businesses are reliant on at least one ecosystem service. And what this means on the macro level is as biodiversity loss continues and nature degradation, ecosystem services are at risk. And ecosystem services are vital for businesses like the businesses we work for to produce high quality goods and services. And without them, companies will suffer, banks' portfolios and credit rates will plummet, and it will become riskier and more difficult to secure investment in the future. This is a statistic I tell everybody when I talk about biodiversity, because it brings to the forefront the reality of not focusing on enhancing biodiversity in business, that it's a real financial reality. My name's Jack Dwyer, and I'm the CEO of Vyra, and I'm here today to speak to a very interesting person. I'm trying to go deeper on the topic of nature as it pertains to business, and I'm trying to provide a really, really valuable hour for everybody here today with a lot of actionables on the various biodiversity frameworks, disclosures, as well as ways to assess your own business and other businesses when it comes to biodiversity risks and opportunities. So I see we have over 100 people in the room today, and I know that people are calling in from various places. So thanks for coming. And before we get into the introduction to our special guests, I just want to go over a couple of other things that we're going to be touching on today. So yesterday, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, for everybody who knows this acronym and what this means, this will resonate. Otherwise, it's something that you will have to start thinking about if you're working in a growing company. They released their final framework on biodiversity yesterday. Now, this has taken on immense importance, and it serves as the foundation for developing mandatory biodiversity disclosures in the future. The significance in this has also led for calls in the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, to develop a biodiversity disclosure based on the recommendations of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Additionally, 200 governments, as part of a global framework, have committed to encouraging biodiversity disclosures by 2030 during COP15 last year. Now, to make data more accessible in the same way that we're trying to do here today, they have also created the Nature-Related Data Catalyst program. And this is something we're going to share links with in the show notes, as well as the notes of our special guest, Eoin Fahy. So with that done as an introduction, and with me setting the scene for you to understand where we're coming at in this webinar today, I'm going to introduce our special guest, Eoin Fahy. How's it going, Eoin?
Afternoon, Jack.
Good to see you. So Eoin's reputation precedes him. He has 35 years experience in the investment space in responsible investment. Eoin works for a company called KBI Global Investors, and he heads up the responsible investments team. At KBI Global Investors, he's responsible for managing assets for the value of 18 billion. And not only this, Eoin is a prominent figure in the responsible investment space in Ireland, but also globally. And he's a member of a number of important sustainability and climate groups to help advance sustainability in the investment space. So, Eoin, we've brought you here today because we want people to understand the perspective from the other side of the table. We want people in business to understand how people in your position assess companies and how you assess opportunities when it comes to biodiversity, and I guess more widely when it comes to climate as well. So I teed it up. I spoke a little bit about the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures. I wanted to start off at the base and ask you to give us a description of that, and describe to people what's going on there.
Sure, Jack. And by the way, just in passing, before I even get into that, I really like the fact that you mentioned in your introduction there a minute ago about the opportunities from biodiversity, because people often talk about the risks, the negatives, but there are opportunities as well. But anyway, there'll be plenty of time to get into that later. But thanks for mentioning that as well. Yeah, TNFD. So the most important thing in a way to tell you about TNFD is that if you are familiar with TCFD, it's really very similar. If you're not, I'll explain a bit more. But if you are familiar with it, then it really is very similar to that, except it's focusing on nature and biodiversity instead of climate. So, but just to go back a second for those who aren't familiar with TCFD, though I think a lot of people are these days, that's the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That hence the letters TCFD. That was set up some years ago by, I think it was the G20, if I remember correctly. It was headed up by a bunch of luminaries, people like the central bank, the governor of two central banks in succession. First the Bank of Canada and then the Bank of England, by the name of Carney, and also by Mike Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York and owns Bloomberg News and so on. So a lot of people around the world, a lot of more technical experts than they indeed, got involved in drawing up a set of recommendations for how companies should disclose information in their accounts. So that's important. This is the statutory accounts, if you like, in their accounts to do with climate change. And that had varied, that had 4 pillars, and it had various things that companies have to do in order to properly comply and tell investors and stakeholders of all kinds, whether that's regulators, staff, investors, or anybody or any other kind of stakeholder, of what they're doing about climate change. So that happened. I actually forgotten when, but off the top of my head, maybe 5-6 years ago that was published. I can't remember. It's all a blur. And an awful lot of companies now do exactly that. An awful lot of companies around the world, whether they're required to by law or not, which varies by country, but whether they're required to by law or not, they now do comply with the principles of disclosure set out in the TCFD. So much more recently then, I think it became increasingly obvious to many people around the world, whether they were investors, regulators, policymakers, whatever, that biodiversity is actually, and nature generally and biodiversity in particular, were really very nearly as important, and maybe even as important as climate change. They really are at that level of importance to what is going on in the world and to the damage being done indeed to the planet at the moment, which, as an aside, if the planet is being damaged, so are investors, which is why people like me from the investment side of the what would I say, from the investment industry, get involved in issues like this, because they really matter to investors. It's not just for the general good, it's because these things matter to our portfolio of investments. So because of the importance of nature and the importance of biodiversity, again, a group of experts came together, international group of experts came together and said, well, look, there's already a framework there that's widely adopted around the world for how companies should disclose what they're doing with regard to climate. Let's do the same with regard to nature and biodiversity. So just yesterday, as you mentioned, that organization published its final report, although I would say that what's in the report is well known for a long time, because there were various beta versions and alpha versions and preliminary versions along the way. So the final, if you like, report was published just yesterday. And basically, they have taken the framework used by TCFD and adopted it to apply to nature. So there's 4 pillars, for example, and companies, I say companies as shorthand, but actually it goes beyond companies. It's also organizations and entities of all kinds, but they're asked to disclose under 4 pillars: governance, strategy, risk and impact management, and metrics and targets. So fairly obvious what each of them do, really. On governance, companies, organizations are asked to disclose what level of board oversight is there of nature and biodiversity, both the opportunities and the risks. What is the board's role in this? Is it something that is discussed by the board? Is there a designated member or members of the board with responsibility for nature and for biodiversity? And that's the first level. The next level of disclosure then is to talk about, at a similar level, who within management is responsible for biodiversity. Because as we all know, if everybody's in charge of it, then nobody's in charge of it and nothing gets done. So companies are asked to really name, what is the person, who's the person in charge of biodiversity, responsible for biodiversity and nature issues in the company, or what structure is there? A committee is there? Ask, and so on, and go through the structures for managing biodiversity issues within the company. Also, they're asked to describe things like human rights policies that a firm would have, what engagement goes on with stakeholders on these issues, etc., etc. Then you come to the second pillar, which is strategy, which really is to disclose what the company is doing about all this in more detail. So, describe how nature could affect the company and describe how the company could affect nature. Both of those are important, both directions. How nature might affect the company is usually called a dependency. It's because a company is dependent on a particular aspect of nature for what it's doing. We can discuss that, maybe how to look at that. You might be surprised by the reliance you have on nature as an organization. You already mentioned that in your introduction, Jack. And then on the other hand, the damage that your company may be doing to nature or to biodiversity. Also to look at any opportunities, and that's the point I made earlier. So it's not all about what could go wrong and what damage you're doing, but also, are there things going on with regard to nature and biodiversity that you can frankly make money out of? Or do you have products that could actually help to solve a problem? And sometimes I think, as I mentioned already, that's a bit underplayed. People are a bit inclined to focus on the risks and the downside, but like any change in society or like any change in the economy, there are people who will benefit as well. And if you take COVID, there were people that made, masks and that aimed at it. And I'm not suggesting people should try to profiteer out of a crisis, but there are opportunities in every crisis as well. Also has to talk about financial planning and things like that. And then the risk and impact management is fairly obvious. That's the next pillar. You're asked to describe the process that your organization uses to use the terminology to identify, assess, prioritize, and monitor your dependencies, your risks, and your opportunities. And then the last pillar is in some ways the most difficult, because it asks about metrics and targets. It asks the companies, organizations to disclose the metrics and targets used to assess and to manage, to go back to this piece of jargon again, the dependencies, the risks and opportunities. And dependencies, risks and opportunities is a term you will find all the way through the TNFD framework. They're always asking about what part of nature are you dependent on, what are the risks to your business and from your business, and what opportunities are there for your business arising from this. So you're asked to say what metrics you're using to measure your dependencies, risks, and opportunities regarding to nature, and then your performance against each of those metrics. I think it's worth saying, Jack, that's the framework. There's lots of detail, and we can maybe get into that if you wish some more detail, and people can read it. Probably enough detail there rather than going too deep. But also just to talk about the significance of this. It's all very well that a bunch of international experts come together and publish a document. Like, so what, in a way? That doesn't mean anything in its own right. But the precedent of the TCFD, I think, is very important, because it's exactly what happened in the case of TCFD. But for any medium or large company now, while it is not legally binding in Ireland, though it is in some countries, while it isn't legally binding to report in line with TCFD, I think a huge number of companies now do it and are expected to do it by their stakeholders, whether the stakeholder is perhaps a company that they supply goods or services to that ask them to do it, or whether it's their staff that expect them to do it to some extent. You're increasingly seeing about doing that. More particularly whether investors, in the case of large companies, their investors will ask them to comply with TCFD, and investors like me or like my colleagues will have tough questions to ask of companies who are not complying with TCFD. So it filters down the chain, and there's more and more pressure on companies to comply with TCFD. And in that way, I think that's exactly what will happen with TNFD, whereby the same process will happen. It's not coming next month. It's not coming next week. Don't panic. But on the other hand, it's definitely coming down the chain. And I would be very surprised if most companies that now report to TCFD or are thinking about reporting in line with TCFD are not pretty soon, let's say within, I'm going to say maybe 2 to 3 years, that kind of time frame at the most, will be under pressure to report in line with TNFD.
Yeah.
And if I mixed up my N and my C there, you'll have to excuse me. There were too many
there's
acronyms around
acronyms flying
TNFD
around,
and
yeah.
TFCD. We'll try to avoid too many acronyms, but they're ones we can't avoid today.
Well, I appreciate you outlining the 4 steps in the framework. I think, again, that's something we can share a bit more information on after. And also, I appreciate you mentioning the opportunities piece and the often less talked about fact, which is everybody is trying to essentially incorporate these things to benefit their goods and their services. So, that's why we're here today. So a quick question from the outside looking in when we talk, now that we've assessed a couple of the frameworks, what is different in how biodiversity is approached internally at KBI Global Investors and then in turn in the portfolio? So just wearing the 2 hats. Internally is the company and then I guess maybe broadly on the portfolio, because I know we have a lot of stuff to talk about there as well.
Sure. I think maybe the most interesting, because I work for an investment firm, maybe the most interesting way to come at it is there are things we do in our own right with regard to biodiversity. We have some projects, some sponsorships, some local activities. They're probably not terribly different to what a lot of businesses would do that are interested in this. They range from sort of staff activities like beach cleanups to planting forestry and making a commitment in that way. But I'm going to put them to one side, Jack, because although they are, I don't want to in any way trivialize them, because they're important projects and they're worth doing and they encourage staff involvement and so on. But many companies are doing things like that. I suppose what I can maybe bring to the table today and talk about a bit more that perhaps people aren't used to hearing is the investor approach or the investment approach. What do we care about as investors in terms of what we're investing in? And there, I think it's important to think to give you a sense of why we already care. Not so much why, because I think today is not a time to talk necessarily about the importance of biodiversity. If you're on this call, you already know, I hope, that biodiversity is very important. But the how, how when we are thinking about investing in a company or thinking about the size of our investment in a company, how do we take biodiversity into account for better or worse? So there's 2 ways really that we do it. One is using external data, and one is our own efforts based on talking to company and getting information directly from company and NGO. So I split it into those 2 categories. First of all, in order to comply with regulatory requirements, but also to help our investment process, we buy data from external suppliers. So we go out there into the market and we buy in from one of a small number of companies. I can talk about the companies later because it might be interesting for companies to know which of those, who are the important data suppliers out there with the most market share and so on. But we go out and, like most investment managers do, we go out and we buy a very large data set from companies that specialize in gathering together vast amounts of information relating to sustainability in general and climate change, other factors, ESG data of all kinds about every listed and many unlisted companies on the planet. So we will get from this external data supplier, or sometimes data suppliers, we'll get data, for example, that will tell us for any given company whether that company is operating in a biodiversity sensitive area, what its carbon emissions are like, any data relating to pollution, whether it has been involved or is involved in controversies in terms of product safety, what its emissions to water are like. So if it's a company if it's an organization that is emitting substances into water, as many factories do, for example, what is the volume of emissions to water that it has? What about hazardous waste? How much hazardous waste does a company produce? And a whole myriad of other things, which goes way beyond nature and biodiversity. It covers things like how many, the percentage of women on a board, and a whole range of other factors. So we spend a lot of money, frankly, to get in that data. That data is then fed into our database and is then directly, and I can't stress enough how important this is, directly used to determine whether we invest in a particular company and how much we invest in a particular company. And there is no investment decision that we make, where that data I'll come on to talk about our internal data as well, but that external data that we buy in, plus our internal information with regard to company sustainability track record, is not used. This data, we don't go out and pay a lot of money for this data to have it sit on the shelf. We use it in our investment decisions. I said that I'd mention maybe some of the companies, not to give ads to companies or anything like that, but I think it's important for
and
organizations to know.
before you
Yeah,
go on,
Jack.
I think
Yeah.
on that point, I think a lot of people might be interested to know the names of some of these data provision services, you know, because in the same way that people like to see how they're being searched, it would be interesting for people to actually see how their companies are being searched as well.
Absolutely. So the main players in this area would be MSCI ESG Research, just MSCI, which also produces things like the MSCI stock market indices around the world, but that's a separate part of the business. They are probably, well, they are the market leader when it comes to sustainability data, whether that relates to nature, climate change, biodiversity, or a whole range of other things. I don't have an exact market share for them, but they might have something like 50% of the market, something like that. So they are very important. They're closely followed by a company called Sustainalytics, which is owned by Morningstar, a US company, and they are a close second. I off the top of my head, maybe they have a 30 or 35% market share. I'm not sure, but something like that. So they will be the two big commercial suppliers of this kind of data to us. Others that feature would be FTSE, because it has a FTSE for Good index. So they're trying to gather together information that will determine whether a company qualifies for a green index, if you like. And there are various others, but they tend to be quite a lot smaller. CDP is in a different category because it's not a commercial company alone. It is an NGO, really, but it's very, very strong in the area of climate change data, but also water and forestry. And water and forestry are closely related to biodiversity. Jack, I think you're going to ask me something there, right?
Well, I was going to say, speaking of FTSE, would there be any room to mention how there's also ESG boots on the ground? Not every company acquires their data through providers, do they?
Absolutely not. We get a lot of we do. I was sort of going to split my remarks into what we buy in externally and then what we do internally. So what I've been talking about today is the external data that we buy in.
Yes.
But we also talk to companies a lot. We also go out and we meet with companies. We visit their factories. I'm not saying that we send a team of 10 people off to run around the jungle in Brazil and check whether anything there is going on that involves our companies. We don't have the resources to do that. I think there are a very small number of investors that literally do put boots on the ground in that sense. But
you're not hiring for that.
We're not hiring in that area. Okay. Sorry, no, we can't help you there. But we do go and visit companies that we invest in. Sometimes it's their head office. Sometimes we visit their factories or their operations or whatever. And we do have very detailed discussions with them on biodiversity issues for any number of reasons. I mean, just off the top of my head, take even a very green business. We specialize in sustainable investments, and for want of a better word, green investments. So we would invest in companies like wind farm operators and so on. So we will want to know. We will go out and ask them, for example. You might think, well, they're very sustainable. You don't need to ask them too many hard questions. Surely, if wind farms tend to be very, very nature positive and so on, or very, very good for the more accurately, very good for the environment in terms of replacing dirty energy with clean energy and so on. Well, we want to know about their blades. There's an awful lot of wind turbine blades. They're extremely large and they're being manufactured around the world and they're being put up on top of wind turbines. But what happens then when they're finished? Where do those turbines go? So we ask them about how they recycle. We'll ask them about whether they comply with the EU's Natura directive, which is kind of what people are probably familiar with, that directive on environmental matters from the EU. Because if they don't comply with the Natura directive, which they have to by law anyway, but if for some reason they didn't, even outside the EU, apply some equivalent framework, we couldn't count them for the purposes of the taxonomy, which I know we haven't spoken about yet, but the EU has produced a taxonomy, which basically is a list of activities that are sustainable and are not sustainable. And we as investors have to report on how much of our investments are sustainable. And one of the factors that determines whether an activity is sustainable or not is whether it complies with various environmental legislation. I don't want to get too details and too complicated too quick, but basically we go out and we ask companies about that, but also beyond just asking about them just facts. So what are you going to do about recycling something, or what are you going to do about the impact on birds of your operations or nature? It's also about getting a sense from the company. Is, you can imagine two scenarios. One is where you go in and ask a company. You had a routine meeting with them that we have with all companies we invest in, and then we ask them biodiversity. So in scenario A, they look at us and basically say, "Oh, we've heard of that. Yeah, what should we be doing? Have you any do you really care about that? We thought investors really only care about making money. Surely you don't really care about biodiversity, do you?" Now, of course, that sets off all kinds of alarm bells, because it is very material, or at least the vast majority of the companies we've looked at, biodiversity is financially material to them, even if they don't realize it. And often they don't realize it, but it is material. Scenario two is you go into a company and say, yeah, we know we have a problem with biodiversity because we know that there's a particular aspect of our operations, or there's something we're doing that isn't perfect in the area of biodiversity. We know we have to deal with that, and we have a 5-year plan, and we're only on year one. So what I'm getting at, obviously that second scenario is much more favorable to us. Of course, the ideal scenario is that said we had a problem last year and we've already solved it, but that in the real world, that hasn't always happened. But we are keen to see that businesses are at the very least aware of the issue. They're disclosing their dependencies, their risks and the opportunities, to use that phrase, DRO, I call it, dependency, risks and opportunities for biodiversity, and they have a plan. And we are, of course, far more likely to invest in a company that shows they have a knowledge of at least a basic knowledge of the impact of biodiversity on their business, the impact of their business on biodiversity, any opportunities that there might be in this area, and have some kind of a plan and a framework to deal with them. We're far more likely to invest in that kind of company.
Okay, yep, interesting. And yeah, you covered everything from how the information is acquired to a couple of different scenarios when it comes to actually contacting these organizations. That leads me on to a question around, that could resonate with different people in the webinar today, which is, you describe how there are businesses that are innately high in biodiversity risk, coming all the way back to the intro, maybe a business that relies on a huge number of ecosystem services, and then businesses that are low biodiversity risk. Now, you said we're not going to go deep into the frameworks around responsible investment, so to speak, but how should the people today in this webinar assess kind of, or provide themselves with a mental rubric to see, high biodiversity risk companies versus low biodiversity risk companies, and the variance in the activities they need to do to actually increase their investor profile?
Yeah, the first thing, one thing I'd mention in passing, by the way, I was talking about sort of MSCI, Sustainalytics, FTSE, CDP earlier on. And I think it's really important that if you're asked questions by those companies, that first of all, you respond to them. Sometimes people take these questionnaires that come in from these companies and throw them in the bin because they're busy people and they don't know how to answer them, so they don't answer them at all. What that means sort of automatically is you come up as NA, did not respond, refused to respond to investors like us, and to other stakeholders indeed, not just to investors. Which clearly is not a good look and is about the worst thing you could do. You're better off to at the very least put in basic information to that kind of response. But I mean, there's other places to start. There's an excellent getting started document from TNFD that I think, Jack, you were going to send round after you're going to send to all attendees some material after the call. We'll make sure that that's included. It's a relatively straightforward, user-friendly, not too long document. It's literally where to get started in all this. There's also a tool online called Encore. We might send around a link to that as well, I think, Jack. And I really like it. It just allows you to pick your sector. So, pick I don't know, maybe you're a financial services company. Maybe that's a bad example actually. But anyway, but you can go to the Encore tool, you can put in the sector you operate in, and it will show you a list of areas where you are dependent on nature and maybe didn't realize it, and also the impact your company maybe has on nature, which in many cases I think people don't realize until they start looking at it. I think that's a great tool, and we'll send it round.
So that's Encore,
ENCORE. Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Encore. There's also an SBTN, I'll try and avoid the acronyms, a science-based target network tool, which again, we can send around a link to, we will send around a link to, which is called a materiality tool. There you can get really detailed on the business activity. So, and often an organization might have lots of different business activities. You can get really, really detailed. Like you can get down to the level of what is the impact on and of nature, or on and from nature, for, say, a call center operation. And under 40 different headings, it will show you whether the impact is low, very low, medium, high, very high, and so on. So it gives you a good sense as a business, even if you have you think you have low biodiversity risk and opportunities. These are two tools you can use to sort of check that and remind yourself and find out, well, actually, I hadn't quite thought about this aspect, or, oh yeah, well, that's something we could take a look at. I think supply chains is very important as well, Jack, because it's not just about, people might say, well, we don't have a factory, say, so therefore, we don't have to worry too much about pollution. We don't have to worry too much about our impact on the water table because we just have an office on the third floor of a building or whatever. But you're selling your service or your products perhaps to people who, so even if you don't have a big impact, you're buying products, I should say, you're buying products and services from companies. So you can start by going to your supply chain and asking them, ask your suppliers, what are they doing about biodiversity? That does two things. First of all, it helps you disclose when the time comes, which is not too far off. It helps you disclose to what you've done about biodiversity. Well, tick a box, you can say we've talked to our suppliers and we've asked them what they're doing. But also, of course, you're spreading the word almost in an evangelical sense. You're going out there and by talking to your suppliers, what you're doing is you're spreading the word and you're telling people that, biodiversity matters to you and therefore it should matter to them. And then you will find, of course, as well, that if you're selling products or services in turn to somebody else, that you'll find they're probably quite soon asking you what you're doing about biodiversity. And it's a lot better to get started on that and have some kind of answers. People don't expect perfect answers. This is a relatively new topic, but that at least you can show you've taken some steps and you have some kind of a framework for addressing these issues when you get asked about it by the businesses that you sell products or service to. Even if you're a small business, you're still going to be asked. And I'll say one last thing, Jack, as well. You didn't ask me to say this, and in fact, you don't know I was going to say it. But I think it's also very important to bring colleagues. You're worried now, are you? But I think it's also very important to bring colleagues with you, because it's all very well if you're the head of sustainability or some similar title in your organization. You can go off and become an expert as much as you can in biodiversity. You can read these documents from TNFD. You can look at the tools that we suggest you look at. That's not much use if you're the only person in your organization that gives a damn about this. You've got to bring your senior management, but not just your senior management, right through the organization. You have to bring people with you on this journey to learning about biodiversity. And we were facing this issue about a year ago, and we went out and decided we really need to educate, maybe that's a patronizing term, but to train, I suppose, or to educate, I don't know what the right term is, all our staff members, everybody in the business on biodiversity issues. And we were able to use your services to do that. Now, this isn't an ad for you, I know, and this webinar isn't about selling your services, but I think it's only fair to say that really when I look back on what we did in our organization over the last couple of years, actually, educating all our staff, using, as it happens, a Vyra product, but I'm sure there are others out there, but using a Vyra product to really bring the message on biodiversity to everyone in the firm, not just one or two sustainability people sitting in a corner. I think that was another really practical step that helped us, and I think would help other businesses going forward. I hope I haven't embarrassed you. I'm sure you don't mind.
If people can't hear, my dog in the background is pretty annoyed at you, so you can deal with him. No, that's a joke. When it comes to, okay, so I want to recap on the start of that point. I wanted to understand the levels of how you assess a company's risk when it comes to biodiversity. And you propose that businesses look at Encore and the SBTN services and how they can actually pretty much self-assess, which I think is really helpful. Can you give an example of a time when you were dealing with a company that was high biodiversity risk, where they did an excellent job of mitigating that, and
Absolutely,
potentially
yeah.
the inverse or a negative story from that as well?
Yep. We're a bit tight in time, so I'll just do it on a kind of summary level. There's a
Yeah.
few examples I could think of. There's a couple on the negative side. So a classic example would be a solar panel manufacturer. Again, you think clean industry, clean energy, wind from the sun, very green, sustainable. Why would there be an issue? Well, the factory they were using to make solar panels was certainly there was at least some evidence that it was causing serious pollution in a river near its factory. The locals protested. There was a major controversy. We talked to the company about it. We actually decided that, notwithstanding their good overall sustainability profile as a manufacturer of something that was very green, that the company wasn't taking this pollution issue seriously at all. They couldn't show us really. Most of all, it wasn't about the technicalities of the pollution. It was about the attitude of the company. They didn't seem to get it that pollution really mattered and that it was not acceptable to be killing fish in a nearby river, or to be even taking the risk that they were killing fish. It seems very likely they were, unfortunately. We sold out the company. That's just a simple example of what can happen. Another example might be a company I can think of that was involved with palm oil production. This is palm oil is an essential product used a lot in Asia for cooking, and it's a big part of diet and so on. But at the same time, it generally means palm oil is often grown in areas that were previously virgin rainforest or virgin forest anyway. And they clear down the old forest, which of course had massive biodiversity benefits, in order to create these palm oil plantations. And this company I can think of was involved in controversies whereby it couldn't prove that, or at least there was serious allegations against it that it had simply gone in and seized land with very little legal right to use that land, not to mention the biodiversity damage it was doing. Again, we sold out of that company completely. If you take an example of a company that's doing a great job, we think there's a wind turbine man. Again, I talked about wind turbines earlier on, but I'll go back to a different wind energy company. It builds and runs offshore wind turbine. There are biodiversity concerns around those turbines because of fears that the noise generated either during the construction of the turbine, these are ones at sea I'm talking about, obviously, the noise generated during construction and indeed during its operation could interfere with fish and other marine mammals. This company is involved in a lot of research to try and investigate whether that's true, but they've taken some practical steps. It was something that caught our eye was that they've actually used 3D printers to make fake reefs, actually, and plant them around their turbines on the seabed, because there was a serious short. This is in the Kattegat, which somewhere off the coast of Denmark, or is it between Denmark and Sweden? I think somewhere like that. And there was a serious shortage of cod. There was a major problem with cod population, as there is in many parts of the world. And the cod apparently sits, I'm no expert in this, but apparently sits at the top of the food chain. And therefore, when there was a shortage of cod, that was trickling down the food chain and having a big impact on biodiversity. By putting in these things that look like reefs, even though they're not actually reefs, apparently has had huge benefits in regenerating the cod population, because cod likes these reefs. They can hide in the holes and the fake holes in the fake reef. It's an example of a company that was doing something very practical. We really like it, and it certainly helped us in our decision to invest in the company.
Interesting. So practical and creative.
Yes.
And there's a lot of people putting in questions. So I just want to say at this point, what we're going to try and do is get in some of your questions in the chat. Any extra questions, we're going to answer them in a document and share them after. And I'm also going to send out a survey to see if there are any questions. So you'll get that to your inbox and you'll be able to share anything you want then for Eoin to answer. There is one more question on my side before I start reading other people's questions. I really like this as the last question because I think one of the things that I hate is going to a webinar and not leaving with anything overly actionable. we've proven that wrong. Obviously, we have a few different things to share, but I just wanted to explore what your, say, 3 to 5 top tips for people in this call are today. You know, bearing in mind we've a broad range of practitioners here, but I'll leave that with you, and then once you've answered that question, I'll rattle into some of the questions that we have in the chat.
I think I've probably covered all these already at other stages in the chat, but let me just quickly summarize. Get that getting started document from TNFD. If you do nothing else, well, you have to do a couple of other things, but do that. It's an easy read. Talked about it already. We'll send the link out. Get that. Have a look at the Encore tool and the SBTN materiality tool. Don't worry too much about getting the wording or trying to find them right now or take it down the details, because we'll send them out afterwards. They're two simple self-assessment, as you call them, Jack. I think that's a way of describing them. Self-assessment tools that'll get you started in terms of where are your dependencies on nature and where is your impact on nature and what opportunities there might be as well. Keep stressing the opportunities, because don't forget that too. So have a look at that. Bring your colleagues with you. I mentioned already, look at not just educating yourself, but bringing your colleagues along with you so that you're all learning at different speeds. Of course, not everyone needs to be an expert, but don't get too far ahead of your colleagues. Focus on supply chains, because you know that the people you are selling to are going to be asking you about your supply chain. So it's an easy place to start in a way. One very practical thing to do is write to your suppliers and just ask them what they're doing about biodiversity. You can find lots of online resources that will give you a few intelligent and helpful questions to ask them and get doing that. Address your vulnerabilities. So even if you can't necessarily, so if you discover that maybe you're already aware that you have a vulnerability in the area of biodiversity, just by the nature of your business, you have an adverse impact on biodiversity. Don't ignore it. Focus on that. Get moving on it. Investors, stakeholders don't expect you to solve every problem immediately. They don't think you can wave a magic wand and fix everything, but they absolutely want to know that you're clued into the fact that you have a problem, that you're thinking about it, that you're putting resources into it. You mightn't have cracked it yet, but you're at least looking at it. And similarly, think about what your strengths. Go back to this opportunities point. Don't always think about this as being a negative. What could you do out there? What practical? Think about the opportunities. Do you have a product? Not every company will, but do you have a product that could actually take advantage of this? Could you, by eliminating the risk, by eliminating some downside to the products that your industry makes, could you get a competitive advantage over competitors? You know, if you're making the equivalent in energy terms of making I don't know, electric car as opposed to a diesel car. It's a bad example, but you get the idea. Could you come up with something that you get a competitive advantage over your competitors by coming up with a product that wasn't damaging the biodiversity when your competitors' products are? So think about the opportunities. That was a lot more than 2 or 3 actions. I think it was about 5 or 6 there, Jack, but I think I talked about most of them already as we went along. So just to summarize them again. No,
that's excellent. And we've about 4 or 5 minutes. So what I'm going to do is pick out 3 questions from the chat. And apologies in advance to anybody whose question I don't get to, but like I said, we will be answering them afterwards and sharing robust answers to these questions. So the first one I'm going to share is from Sam Dresner Barnes. And what his question is straightforward. It's, do you as an investor have a preference for ESG labeled debt, which has been externally assured or supported by an SPO? With this in mind, do you see any market growth in specific biodiversity labeled debt insurance and external assurance?
I have to apologize in that our firm only invests in equities, not debt. So I'm not an expert in things like green bonds or debt. I would say as a general principle that investors think that labels are important, but the larger and the more sophisticated investors will see that as a starting point, because they will have slightly different requirements to what any label or indeed regulation requires. So I think increasingly labels are probably a very good starting point, but they're not the finishing point. Investors will, in general, want to see more than just a label. It's a big help, and it's a box ticked, but it's a box ticked rather than their box ticked. I can't think of a better way of describing it like that. Having said that, I can't comment on some of the detailed questions there about debt because it's not my field. We are an equities only house. Apologies for that.
Yeah, I think this second question is an excellent one, and you'll be able to answer quite directly. So Apart from supply chain, is there any matrix required for own assets, building sites, portfolios? How relevant is that in the TNFD?
Well, the TNFD doesn't get into the sort of level of detail of talking about how, what, it sounds like did I understand? It's kind of a question about construction, is it? Or is it?
Yeah, so own
Yeah.
assets and building sites, yeah.
Yeah, so the TNFD doesn't get into that level of detail of saying, that a financial company should do this and a building company should do that. It's more a framework. But what is common to every kind of company is those four pillars we talked about. Like what is your governance for biodiversity? So what you're being asked in TNFD is to describe not what you're doing, at least at first. You're not asked what you're doing about a particular building society or building society, building site, or what structure you have around that. But first of all, like what is your board doing about biodiversity? Who is responsible within your company for biodiversity? Then you're asked about, what are the risks and opportunities to your business? So in the case of something to do with construction, you'd be asked, how could nature adversely affect your business for starters?
Right.
I mean, take a simple one like floods is a bad example, but it's the first one that comes into my head. And how, or some other eco service, some eco service, if it was damaged, what would the impact be on your business, and then the impact of that building site or operation on climate. So both are on biodiversity. The impact of nature on your business, the impact of your business on nature, the two sides, and then go work through the framework. So I suppose that's kind of my answer, is to work through the framework in TNFD. It's not building or construction specific, but the framework can be applied by anybody.
Okay, sure. And that question was from Krista Devan. This is the last question, and then the rest of the subsequent questions will be answered afterwards. And this one's from Hendrik Ludolf, and the question is around data. How is it scientifically, empirically assured that bought data is the right data to assess the situation, and that the data is correctly measured with adequate intervals, non-synthetic, non-extrapolated, non-falsified, etc.? Even MSCI data gets the data from somewhere. Also, the commercially oriented data provider have to be trusted too.
Yeah, dead right. The answer is you can't. So we or anybody. That's why I talked about both external data and internal data. So we start with this data dump almost of a vast amounts of data that is given to us by our supplier, and that goes into our systems, etc., etc. Now, having said that, the data when it comes in, of course, the supplier would naturally tell us about all the levels of data checks they've done. They used AI to check it for consistency with previous years and with peers, and they have all sorts of cleansing and data activities, so that it should pick up a lot of those problems. But nonetheless, there's no doubt we can look, we can ask, we can seek information about a company from 3 different suppliers for the same fact, and we may get, in some cases, not always, we may get 3 different answers, whereas really there's only one answer. So it shows you that 2 of those 3 suppliers, maybe even 3 of those suppliers, are wrong. So the data is far from perfect, despite all the efforts that the external company put into it. But that's where our own research comes into play. So we don't generally make decisions based only on external data, but it tells us where to look. It tells us where to ask deeper questions. It's often by way of an orange flag as opposed to a red flag, if you like. It tells us we need to go and talk to that company because on the face of it, they have a major exposure to this, that, or the other concern. It's at that point that we carry out what we call engagement with a capital E, where we go and we talk to the company, we ask them questions, we send them questionnaires, we look through their sustainability report, we try and go back to and get as close to the truth in terms of the data as you can. Look, our business as an investment manager, what do we do as an investment manager? It is to analyze data, whether that's profit and loss, whether it's balance sheet, whether it's dividends, whether it's the quality of the management, whether it's the impact on nature, whether it's the carbon emissions. That's what we as an industry, that's what we as a firm do for a living, if you like. It is taking in huge amounts of information, recognizing that it's not perfect, recognizing that no 2 data sources will be exactly the same, that companies have, in many cases, strong incentives to distort the data, notwithstanding the legal and regulatory framework that's there. But this is something we do, I suppose, and that our investment industry has done successfully, unsuccessfully, but we've been doing it for generations, I suppose, in terms of managing investments. And it is not dealing with difficult or unreliable data is not new to us. We've seen the accounts of of Enron or whatever, or various other things over the years. The fact is that there's no data you get as an investment manager that you can rely on internally. Sorry, you can rely on completely is the word I meant.
Exactly, unless you're putting on the fishing hat and booking a few flights. But Eoin, really appreciate your time today. And one thing I want to say to everybody who's still in the room, part of today was supposed to be a deeper dive on reporting frameworks, and our reporting expert couldn't make it today. So that's happening now in a number of weeks. So while this was about the investment lens, the next one will be specifically around reporting and the CSRD. So we're going to put in a link in the chat, and that's for our private newsletter. In that newsletter, you'll get a recap of everything from today, the recording direct to your inbox, and you'll also get a link to pre-register for the reporting specific webinar in the event that that's what you were focused on today. So that link is in the chat now. And for everybody who asked questions, appreciate it. We'll get those answers to you as soon as possible. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day and take that last 5 minutes now to get a cup of tea. But yeah, thanks everybody for coming today.